So another issue that arises as we look at this subject of anti-Semitism and Christian theology is to understand the history of the church. And unfortunately, there's a sad and tragic legacy of the church being involved in anti-Semitism. And if you read the Apostle Paul's words in Romans chapter 11, one of the first things that he warns in verse 25 is he says that he does not want us to be ignorant of these issues, to be uninformed of these issues. And he goes on to explain that a partial hardening has happened to Israel, and he then outlines a whole theology of Israel. And unfortunately, as we look at the history of the Christian church, ignorance has been one thing, unfortunately, that does characterize our relationship with the Jewish people. If you go all the way back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, you'll immediately start to notice the anti-Jewish flavor that was entering through the church for a number of different reasons. They call this the parting of the ways in theological terms. It describes that period where the nascent messianic Jewish believing body, which started and begun the church, became the minority in the church as more Gentiles flooded in, and then in the 4th century as Constantine made Christianity the state religion, multitudes of people, many of which were probably not believers, joined the institutional church, bringing with them Greek philosophical methods of interpretation and all sorts of prejudices that they had in the Greco-Roman world against the Jewish people. So by the time you get to the Council of Nicaea, in the 4th century there, we know that there were no Jewish bishops invited to that event, which is indicative of showing you how the church was separating itself from its Jewish roots. And then throughout the next couple of centuries, you have this legacy of literature that's known as the Adversos Judaeos, which means the against the Jews. And this are coming from many of the patristic fathers, people like Chrysostom, who in many ways was considered a great preacher for the early church, but he also wrote an 8-volume book called the Oracles Against the Jews. And he said some horrible things against the Jewish people, as did many of the church fathers. Even when you jump into the Reformation times, you find people like Martin Luther, who initially was quite favorable towards the Jewish people, but after they didn't accept his gospel preaching and it wasn't quite as easy to convert them as he originally thought, he ended up seeing them as a problem. And he wrote that tract on the Jews and their lies. And you look into Nazi Germany and you'll find that quoted many times in Nazi writing. And this, unfortunately, is a terrible legacy that the church has. Even one of the greatest church fathers for both Western civilization and also for Protestants and Catholics, Augustine, he formulated what is known as the witness doctrine. And this was his way to try and understand and give a place to the Jewish people. And although some people claim that this tempered persecution of the Jewish people, what actually happened is that it gave justification for treating them terribly. The witness doctrine states that because of the sin of the Jewish people in rejecting the Messiah, they were forever to wander the earth as homeless people with no nation, and they were really just a sign. They would be a witness to what happens when you reject the Messiah. And if you could imagine what that sort of a teaching in the hands of the wrong people who had anti-Semitism in their hearts, you could easily use that as justification. And history proves that is exactly what happened. So when we look into the early era of church history, we find what is called punitive supersessionism. And this is the idea that the Jewish people, because of their rejection of the Messiah, a charge that later became known as the deicide charge. This was the fact that they didn't only reject the Messiah, that they killed the Messiah. This was used as a reason to say that the Jewish people were cast off and that they were under judgment and that basically they had no purpose or no future. And if you look at the deicide charge, you'll find that even today you see people raising that in their persecutions against the Jewish people. And it really persisted for the next 1,000 years of Jewish history quite frequently, especially in the medieval era. The deicide charge against the Jewish people as reason for their persecution. And this led to social persecution and physical persecution. Jewish people being banned from holding office, from owning homes, all sorts of different things. Many of these laws were ecclesiastical in nature, and a lot of it was motivated by this belief in punitive supersessionism. There's just one type of supersessionism. There were many other types that we find throughout church history rearing their ugly head. Some not as bad, but that was probably the worst one. But we do find a legacy of anti-Semitism attached to supersessionism throughout church history.